I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 11 of my series on the JFK assassination. When President Kennedy was taken into Trauma Room 1 at Dallas's Parkland Hospital, the physicians naturally immediately went into emergency mode, assessing the situation and determining where Kennedy needed the most urgent treatment. For example, one of the physicians took a scalpel and performed a tracheotomy on the president, cutting a very small, thin cut right across the front of his neck where he inserted a breathing tube. But in the process of making this assessment, one of the physicians said to the others, "Hey fellas, you need to come and take a look at this." And so they went around to where the head of the president was, and his head was slightly lifted, and they could all see a massive, like 2-inch in diameter hole in the lower region of President Kennedy's skull, in what is known as the occipital region of the skull. They saw that coming out of this wound was the part of the brain called the cerebellum, which is the lower back part of the brain. At this point, they all knew that it was over. They knew that there was nothing they could do to save this man's life. Nobody can survive a wound of that nature. And so for all practical purposes, it was really just a matter of waiting for the president to die. And sure enough, within a half hour or so, President Kennedy had passed away. About an hour later, two of the physicians, Dr. Clark Kemp, the chief of neurosurgery at Parkland, and Dr. Malcolm Perry, held a press conference. And at this press conference, they described two wounds that they had seen on President Kennedy. One was a small bullet-sized wound on the front of President Kennedy's neck, over which the small tracheotomy had been cut, and they described that and emphasized that that was an entry wound, which of course would imply a shot having been fired from the front. And then they talked about this large wound in the back of President Kennedy's head. Now, one of the reasons why the size of wounds are important is that they help physicians or pathologists discover which are the entry points and which are the exit points for bullets. When a bullet enters a person's body, it enters with a very small hole, essentially the size of the bullet. But as it's proceeding through the body, it's pushing mass in front of it. In the case of a head wound, it's pushing brain mass in front of it. And so when it exits on the other side, it exits with a blowout on the other side. Now, if you want to get a good sense of what the wound looked like and where it was located, there are several presentations by Dr. Robert McClellan online, one of the treating physicians, speeches, presentations, interviews, and the like. And then there's also a great book called Trauma Room 1 by Dr. Charles Crenshaw that talks about the wound in the occipital region of the skull. Now, as you can imagine, there were several witnesses, well, as everybody knows, there were several witnesses in Dealey Plaza where the assassination took place. And one of these was a man named Charles Brem, and he was located in the center part of the plaza to the left rear of the limousine, the presidential limousine. In other words, the limousine had already passed him by. And he stated that when President Kennedy was hit in the head, he saw, for lack of a better term, exit debris coming out of the back of President Kennedy's head and landing in the grass near him. Another witness was Marilyn Willis. She was also behind the limousine, and she said she also saw stuff coming out of the back of President Kennedy's head. Her daughter said she saw the president's head, just the back of the president's head, just blow out. And then there were two motorcycle policemen, B.J. Martin and Bobby Hargis, who were riding jointly to the left rear of the limousine. And when the shot hit President Kennedy, they were splattered, or their cycles were splattered with exit debris. Now, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Zapruder film. Abraham Zapruder was a Dallas businessman. He goes out to Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination with his brand new movie camera, and sure enough, he ends up filming the assassination. And there's the scene in the film where President Kennedy gets shot in the head, and his wife Jacqueline immediately starts going back to the trunk, on the trunk of the car. The speculation is that she saw stuff coming out of the back of her husband's head, and she was going back to retrieve it, obviously in terrible shock. But at the same time, there's a Secret Service agent named Clint Hill who's coming from a follow-up car and grabbing onto the end of the presidential limousine. He succeeds in doing that, and then he pushes Mrs. Kennedy back in her seat, and then he lies down on the body of the president, trying to protect the president from any more shots. As we all know, that's the job of a Secret Service agent, to put himself in front of the president, even giving up his own life. Hill stated that in the 6 or 7 or 8 minutes that it took to get to Parkland Hospital, he was looking at this large wound in the lower back of President Kennedy's head. When the limousine got to Parkland Hospital, the hospital personnel were there ready to assist the president to get out of the car and into the hospital. And one of these people was a nurse named Diana Boron. And she testified or stated that she saw this small bullet-sized wound in the front of President Kennedy's neck, and then when she put her hand behind his head to help him get out of the car, she could feel the large wound in the lower back of the head. Another nurse named Audrey Bell, who was in the treating room, Trauma Room 1, and helping the physicians, she later attested to the fact that the president had this large wound in the lower back of his head. On the day after the assassination, there was a medical student named Billy Harper who was walking around Dealey Plaza, and he happened to find a bone fragment. It just so happened that his uncle was a pathologist there in Dallas at Methodist Hospital, so he took the bone fragment to his uncle, and his uncle proceeded to put a small team of pathologists together, and they summoned the hospital medical photographer. They took a picture of the bone fragment, which became known as the Harper fragment, and this team of pathologists analyzed the bone fragment and concluded that it was occipital bone, which would make sense since the wound was in the occipital region of the skull. Now, at this point, it's worthwhile recalling the testimony of Sondra Spencer. Sondra Spencer, as you'll recall from a previous episode, was the U.S. Navy petty officer that was working in the U.S. Navy's photography lab in Washington, D.C. She had a top secret security clearance. She dealt with classified photographs. She developed photographs, including autopsy photographs. She worked closely with the White House. As I indicated in that earlier segment, it would be virtually impossible to find a more credible, more competent witness than Sondra Spencer. Well, she was summoned to testify before the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s. Now, just as a review, the ARRB was called into existence. It was a commission to enforce the JFK Records Act, which mandated that all federal agencies, the military, the CIA, the Secret Service, FBI, all of them, release their JFK-related records to the public after some 30 years after the assassination. Now, Sondra Spencer appeared. Let me first say something about the ARRB that I haven't pointed out before and that you might not be familiar with. When the JFK Records Act was enacted and they brought in the ARRB to enforce it, Congress included a provision in this law for some reason that absolutely prohibited the ARRB from investigating or reinvestigating any aspect of the Kennedy assassination. Their mandate was strictly limited to getting documents released. And the governing board of the ARRB strictly enforced this restriction. They made it very clear that if any staff member violated it and began investigating or reinvestigating any aspect of the Kennedy assassination, he would be subject to being immediately terminated. Well, Sondra Spencer is summoned to testify before the ARRB, not to investigate or reinvestigate the Kennedy assassination, but, in their words, to clarify the record. And she told an astounding story, as I indicated in the previous segment. It was a story she had kept secret for some 30 years. She had been led to believe that it was classified, top secret, and recall that we talked about the culture of the military, that when somebody in the military gets access to classified information, he is expected to keep it secret for the rest of his life. Take it to the grave with him. And that's what Sondra Spencer had done for 30 years or so. So she appears before the ARRB, and the general counsel for the ARRB presents her with the official autopsy photographs for President Kennedy. She closely examines them and then looks at the general counsel and says, "No, sir, those are not the photo. I was asked to develop the autopsy photographs for President Kennedy on the weekend of the assassination, and I can tell you that those are not the photographs that I developed. The ones I developed showed a massive wound in the back of President Kennedy's head. Those photographs show the back of his head to be intact."